Chapter 3. It's dangerous. They couldn't be serious. Impa and Telma sat across from Zelda, inside the inn's lounge at a dining table, clutching hot teas in their hands and staring at her expectantly. They were awaiting her reply. But what could she say to something like this? Something this impossible. They were asking too much of her now, reaching too far. The Princess of Hyrule would swallow her pride for countless reasons. But this?
Absolutely not,
She whined.
Zelda, we cannot hide you forever.
Impa snapped. Telma gave Impa a wary look.
It is a lot to ask of her.
She relented.
Perhaps we should try and think of another way.
She smiled weakly at Zelda, who simply glared at the two women. She tried debating Impa's comment in her mind, but came up empty. They had been hunkered down for a week now, only Impa having left the inn to run the necessary errands. Zelda had been quarantined to the room except for mealtimes. This had been fine with her, despite the awful bed that she was fairly certain had caused a permanent crick in her neck. But she knew that eventually she would have to show her face, to get some sun, to feel the air again. She had been cooped up enough as a royal princess. This was beginning to become more than uncomfortable. But there was still the risk of being recognized, and that was where Impa and Telma's idea had come into play.
I will not be paraded around in a costume,
She said with finality.
It won't be a costume. It will be who you must become,
Impa said, her expression severe.
Impa, I'm not like you. I can't just pretend I'm something I'm not.
Zelda's face reddened as she realized what she'd just spoken aloud. There was a fair amount of prejudice against the Sheik people in Hyrule, and Impa had not escaped the judging looks and back-alley whispers about her character and trustworthiness. The king, of course, had invested more trust in her than anyone, but he was the rarity. Even Zelda herself had had her doubts once she was old enough to understand the irony of a Sheikah employed by the royal family. In truth, though, she had learned Impa's true character, and she knew that what she just said was baseless. She was just angry. Impa kept her cool, though her eyes narrowed.
You will always be a princess at heart, but for now, you must become someone else, someone who exists as far away from a princess as possible. But the decision has been made.
She rose from her chair and turned down the musky hallway, her footfalls soft, and whatever anger she might be feeling contained. Zelda stared at her lap, feeling a sense of shame and childish frustration. She knew it was immature, but she refused to look at Telma, who sipped her tea in silence for a moment. After a few tense seconds, Zelda felt Telma's calloused hand grasp her wrist that sat upon the tabletop. She wondered what had made those hands so roughened. Perhaps decades of dishes and clothes washing. Her duties as an innkeeper included many tasks, such as those and more. It was hard work, and she did it all alone. She'd even made Zelda a new dress to wear that wasn't as royally fashion-forward, but was a pleasant pink with fabric that felt velvety soft. A lovely gesture, really. After everything Telma had done for them, here Zelda sat, moping in stubborn indignation. She likely seemed ungrateful, but she just couldn't bring herself to adjust her mood.
Sweet girl,
Telma began.
You've been through so much pain.
Zelda frowned slightly, feeling tears begin to well up. Her chambermaid's eyes, lost to time, flashed in her mind.
I wish I could take all of your pain away. The best I can do is support you. I need you to know that this whole thing was my idea, not Impa's, so please don't blame everything on her. She just wants you safe.
Zelda deigned a glance upward and saw Telma smiling sadly.
I'll tell you one thing,
She continued.
I can make you the most magnificent costume you've ever seen.
She winked. Zelda couldn't help but crack a small smile back. So it seemed she would have to change. Not just her clothing, but her everything. Mannerisms, voice, mindset. To blend in. To become invisible. Zelda had to become a Sheikah. As she plucked the strings of the harp Telma had gifted her, playing the lullaby of her namesake, Zelda let her mind wander backward. Back to when she first met the boy in green and told him of her dreams, her plan. He had been so receptive, so ready for adventure. An aura of eagerness surrounded him and made it so easy to talk to him and let down her defenses. He hadn't even asked any questions. She had thrown an abundance of information at him all at once, and he hadn't flinched. She supposed it had something to do with the fact that he was the chosen hero. She knew this because of her visions and the way they highlighted how important a boy wearing green clothing and possessing a fairy would be. Being from the forest, living right next to the infamous Lost Woods, wherein many had gone and never returned. He already held so much natural courage within him, perfect for the task she set before him, and it had led him to certain destruction. She plucked a wrong note, the dissonance it created jarring to her ears, and slammed the harp down onto the table in the dank room with an angry sigh. The harp had always been a bit more difficult for her to learn, the ocarina so much more intuitive somehow. But she had been trained on several instruments, and Telma just so happened to own a harp. So here she was, trying to hold on to a bit of her old self, a bit of her old life, because her new life was very different. She allowed her gaze to wander toward the full-length mirror that Telma had installed on the wall opposite the window. Golden light from the morning's sunrise poured into the room, reflecting off of the shiny surface. She could just see the dark blue tights and off-white arm wraps she now sported, garments that were completely new to her wardrobe. The only time she'd ever worn trousers or anything like them was when she'd taken the fencing lessons for which Impa had advocated years ago. Zelda hated fencing, and weapons training of any kind. Sometimes she enjoyed training with the bow, but she wasn't very good and rarely hit her targets. It was just fun to try. Now she had to wear these tight-fitting, unflattering, ghastly clothes that seemed to choke her limbs rather than protect them. She missed her dresses, the breeze flowing about her legs, the freedom of space, and the delicate colors. She looked just like a boy now. In fact, Impa had been trying to convince her that she needed to act like one too. She needed to become something as far away from a princess as possible. At first, Zelda hadn't truly realized what Impa had meant by that. But now she knew. She knew that it meant she was to become her opposite. A Sheikah instead of a royal princess. A warrior instead of an academic. A boy instead of a girl. And in some sense, an adult instead of a child. Zelda had to rein in her instinctual recoil at Telma's reveal of the costume she was now wearing. She had fawned over it for Telma's benefit, which earned her some brownie points with the inn owner, but the constant pretending, the never-ending playing at being whatever and whoever it was that Impa wanted her to be, she feared it would drain her to empty. She frowned at her reflection and pulled her neck wraps higher, covering as much of her face as she could. She was to go out into the open today, for the first time since they'd arrived in Kageno. No one had asked about the little girl who trailed Impa all the way to the inn, thank the goddesses, but Zelda couldn't help but remember that boy she'd seen on the wagon. They'd locked eyes. Just enough time, she thought, for which to make an impression. He may not be the only person who would have a fleeting memory of her. The risk was great. But Impa said she couldn't stay locked inside the inn forever. And admittedly, she didn't want to be.
It's dangerous,
she thought.
but you must.
And so she forced herself to stand, adjusting the tights that stuck in all the wrong places, just as Impa entered the room to retrieve her.
It's time,
she said, her red eyes bright, shining a focus with which Zelda was familiar. Zelda nodded, taking in a cleansing breath and releasing it, trying to let go of her apprehensions.
I'm ready,
she said. Impa smiled with satisfaction and held out a hand. Zelda stepped forward and took it without complaint, putting on a brave face, though no one could see it beneath her face wraps. The face wraps might have been the worst part of her new persona. Telma and Impa argued for what seemed like hours about how to hide Zelda's face. Telma actually thought she shouldn't, claiming she could adjust Zelda's hair just enough to make her less feminine. But Impa was too concerned with someone recognizing her, Zelda essentially being the face of Hyrule. Even those who didn't live there might have knowledge of the royal family. So the wraps became the compromise. Her head was wrapped too, as Zelda certainly would not allow her hair to be cut short. They considered dyeing it white to match Impa's, but she was insistent. No one would touch her hair, especially after learning that not all Sheikahs sported white hair. She felt mummified, but she also felt hidden, which she knew was Impa's main mission. No one would know that underneath all that fabric hid a royal princess and fugitive. Before they left the room, Impa rummaged through a pocket and pulled out a small glass vial filled with red liquid.
Look up, princess,
she commanded. Zelda did as she was told, dreading how it would feel. She'd already been forewarned that she would be magically altering her eye color from blue to red to fully shift her into her Sheikah persona. It was temporary, so each day she would have to apply the elixir to ensure the color remained. Otherwise, everyone would recognize that she was simply in disguise. Impa unscrewed the dropper and dripped the liquid into her right eye first, then her left. She felt a small sting, but it was bearable. Impa watched her carefully, then smiled.
It worked. You truly look Sheikah now.
Zelda forced a smile, and Impa turned her toward the mirror so that she could see the change. Her eyes widened at the sight. She didn't recognize herself. They descended the stairs into the lobby of the inn, and Telma waved to them as she finished checking in a new patron, a Hylian man. Zelda felt a small jolt inside at the sight of him, but he gave her no notice as he took the room key from Telma and walked past them toward his room. There was something familiar about him. He looked haggard and sad. She wondered if he had also come from Hyrule. She took another slow breath. He didn't seem to recognize them, so everything would be fine, right? She was no longer Zelda. Wait.
What's my name?
She asked Impa, tugging at her arm.
If I'm not Zelda.
Impa raised her eyebrows in surprise. She was probably kicking herself for neglecting to choose a new name for the princess turned Sheikah. Telma snickered from behind the front desk.
What a detail to forget,
she said with a smirk.
What name would you prefer?
Zelda had not expected to be given a choice in the matter. Impa didn't protest Telma's question, so she thought hard for a moment.
I'm not sure, but perhaps a name that feels royal?
Her expression apprehensive, she watched Impa's face for a sign of annoyance, but none showed. Instead, her guardian smiled.
How about we name you after the first Sheikah, the man for which the race was named? He was known as Sheik, the closest thing to royalty our people have known.
Sheik. The similarity to the word Sheikah was rather silly at best, but also she thought it honorable to be connected to such a man, to someone who basically built an entire empire. That certainly seemed royal. Perhaps it was immature to wish for such a name and connotation, but Zelda wanted to cling to her roots as much as she safely could.
Yes,
She replied, holding her head high.
I will be Sheik.
Chapter 4. To Go Alone. Zelda stood back, hiding behind Impa, gaping at the group of children in front of them. A school. A school with other children. Impa had mentioned that she would be continuing her education, but Zelda hadn't realized she would be pursuing it alongside strangers. As the princess, she had been tutored on her own, able to study in her own way, take in knowledge in a blissfully solo fashion. But now she would be forced to learn differently. The children ran and played outside of the schoolhouse on an expanse of green grass under a beautiful blue sky. Zelda hadn't been exposed to this many children in one setting before, and she felt the chaos of it right in her soul. She began to panic, and couldn't help the frightened frown that overtook her brow. Impa noticed Zelda's change in demeanor and knelt down to her level.
Everything will be all right.
She said, lightly palming Zelda's cheek.
You will benefit from this social atmosphere. Look at them. They're having fun.
Zelda's gaze drifted back over at the screaming children as they laughed and happily skipped, jumped, and sprinted. A trio of girls held hands and spun in a circle, while two boys sat on the ground, building something that looked like a castle with wooden blocks. Another group tossed a ball back and forth. Whether it looked like fun or not, Zelda couldn't really tell. She'd never played with another child. While she had met children of noblemen and women, they were all tutored in the same way as she, and many of them lacked social skills. Now that she thought about it, Link was the only child she'd ever met with whom she felt wholly comfortable.
What if they don't like me?
She whispered, a sense of dread filling in her chest. Impa smirked.
My dear, that is impossible. You're only saying that because you have to.
Zelda replied with a pout.
I'm saying it because it's true. You will make friends, I promise. And you'll be better for it. Just...
Impa hesitated for a moment, glancing about as though checking for eavesdroppers.
Be careful.
Her red eyes bored into Zelda's with purpose.
I will.
Impa nodded and stood. She grasped Zelda's hand and led her toward the children, who now began to notice the pair. Zelda scanned the faces, both Sheikah and Hylian, wondering what they were like. If they would be open to her unannounced arrival, or if they would shun her. Perhaps they were used to new students. As her eyes swept over the two boys on the ground, she gasped, recognizing one of them. The boy from the wagon when she'd first arrived in Kageno. He was Hylian, short-cropped black hair framing a rounded face, which seemed to have a permanent smile etched into it. But when he saw her, it faltered a little. She wasn't sure if it was because he recognized her, or if he was disappointed at her presence. Either way, she felt naked under his gaze. "Rovin, come on, don't give up so easy," the boy next to him begged. He was smaller in stature, but looked much like the wagon boy. Perhaps they were brothers. Rovin's attention went back to the blocks, and he didn't seem concerned with Zelda anymore. A wizened old Sheikah man emerged from the schoolhouse, just as they walked up to the door. He wore spectacles that seemed to magnify his eyes 10 times their size. His white hair frizzed this way and that, and he was almost as short as Zelda, his stature seemingly shrunken in his old age. "Ah, our new student has arrived," he exclaimed as he flashed a gummy smile. "And what is your name, might I ask?" While he directed the question at Zelda, she couldn't seem to move her mouth to answer. Instead, Impa stepped forward.
Professor Robbie, this is Sheik. Sheik, your new instructor.
Zelda almost curtsied, her instinct for social graces kicking in. But instead, she managed to nod her head respectfully, and the old professor maintained his smile in response. Welcome, Sheik. That's quite the respectable name, young man. It's a pleasure to have you here with us. Come, meet your classmates. All at once, the students ceased their playing and lined up in a row in front of the building, quieting down. Professor Robbie hadn't even commanded it. At least they had some control over their raw excitement. The professor guided Zelda in front of the row of students, and her heart pounded. Everyone, welcome Sheik to our little group.
Hello,
Sheik. The students sang obediently. Zelda flushed underneath her face wraps. She gave a small wave in response. Professor Robbie chuckled. Now, Sheik, we still have 10 more minutes of recreational time. I'll let you get acquainted. He strode back into the schoolhouse, his hands clasped behind his back, and the children dispersed. He seemed nice enough. Impa smiled down at her.
I can see the worry in your eyes. Just give this a chance, all right?
Zelda nodded and tried to sigh the weight of it off her shoulders.
I'll be okay.
She said to her guardian. She must get a hold of herself. She had been through worse things than having to meet a group of silly children. Even if she made no friends at all and had to go alone toward whatever fate awaited her, she would do it. Impa squeezed Zelda's shoulder and turned away, leaving the princess to her fate. Just then, she felt a tap on her back. She turned and saw a familiar face, though she couldn't quite place it. A Hylian girl gazing back at her, smiling pleasantly. Her brown eyes were earnest and inviting.
Sheik, would you like to sit with us?
She asked. She gestured towards a group of girls sitting in the grass close to where the wagon boy sat. Zelda cleared her throat and tried to speak in a lower tone than was natural to her. She was supposed to be a boy, after all.
Of course.
She said.
Thank you.
She self-consciously adjusted her natural accent, which was still very different from these children, to a more generic one. Her true and lilting voice had set her apart from the common people of Hyrule, a defining feature of royal family members. And she couldn't allow it to give her away.
So,
The girl said as they sat in the grass.
where are you from?
An immediate hard question. Impa and Zelda had discussed at length Sheik's origins and how she could spin his sudden appearance in Kageno, but it made it no less nerve-wracking to answer.
Labrina.
She replied, thankful that she only had to manipulate her gaze rather than her entire facial expression. Then she decided to employ the tactic Impa had suggested she use when she felt overwhelmed by questions.
What's your name?
She asked, and the girl perked up even more. People loved to talk about themselves, and Zelda would keep them talking for as long as she could, if only to avoid having to speak herself.
I'm Milana.
She reminded Zelda of Malon, Lon Lon Ranch's famed daughter and ranch hand. It was this connection that sparked recognition in Zelda's mind.
Oh, you're the girl from the stables.
Zelda exclaimed, still somehow managing to keep her lower vocal tone, but her eyes widened at her own unabashed statement. Milana didn't know Zelda as the girl who had recently arrived in town, relinquishing trust to the stable. For a moment, she felt she had ruined everything, but Milana simply laughed.
I am. The horses are my best friends.
She said.
Hey!
One of the other girls shouted at her, giving Milana a playful push on the arm.
I thought we were your best friends.
Milana continued to giggle.
Sorry, I forgot.
She smirked, and the group of girls burst into fits of uncontrolled laughter. Zelda felt almost like an intruder, an outsider, butting into an inside joke which she'd never understand. Milana's attention went back to Zelda after a few moments, and she grasped her arm good-naturedly.
Hey,
She began.
don't worry. We're all friends here.
Zelda forced a smile, and she hoped it reached her gaze in a genuine way. The lesson that day was a simple one, and Zelda had no trouble keeping up. Mathematics was her strong suit, after all. She'd sped through the numbers and finished before anyone else, but then tried to look busy as she realized this may draw her unwanted attention. She pretended to erase answers and rewrite them. Every now and again, she noticed the wagon boys stealing glances her way. No one else really gave her much notice except for Milana, who seemed intent on keeping Zelda uplifted with regularly scheduled smiles. She had to keep reminding herself that everyone was viewing her as an average schoolboy and not a princess. Hyruleans treated Zelda with more respect and reverence than anyone in their world, but being attended to in that way now would be disastrous, so the looks from Roven only kept her on edge. Why was he staring at her so much? She kept her gaze downward on her parchment, unwilling to give in to the temptation of acknowledging him. As the day ended and the students were dismissed, Zelda sighed out her relief and stood to leave the school building, but not before Milana trotted up to her excitedly. Children, including Roven, swept past them and out of the door, toward which Zelda gazed longingly. She just wanted to leave.
Would you like to come to the grotto with a few of us? We go after school at the end of every week. It's beautiful there, and adventurous. Unless you need to ask your,
My Aunt Impa.
Zelda said, answering the unasked question. She wasn't sure what to say. She was exhausted. The role she'd been playing had taken a toll, just as she'd suspected it would. She wasn't sure she was up to committing to full-on social engagements quite yet. But her Aunt Impa would always be a good excuse to use in order to avoid such things.
I think I'll pass for today.
She gave Milana an apologetic frown and left the building, relieved, finally, of her burden of pretending.
Oh, okay, well, see you in a few days then.
Milana shouted after her, clearly disappointed. Zelda felt an increasing guilt as she walked back to the inn. Impa had told her she should make friends. Was she avoiding that duty? It was too early on, though, only the first day. She didn't want to commit to such an endeavor just now. As she obsessively ruminated on whether or not she had made a sound decision saying no to Milana's invitation, Roven's presence went conveniently unnoticed by her, and she walked right smack into him as she reached the stairs of the inn. And she, of course, had just removed her face and head wraps. Too early, too impatiently, only desiring to rip the ghastly costume from her body, revealing every inch of her royal face to the wagon boy's wide, knowing eyes. They gawked at each other. Zelda wasn't sure what sort of expression she was making, but it couldn't have been an attractive one. Roven, however, looked entranced as his hazel eyes bored into her face that she knew should be covered. She should be hiding, she should be disguised, but he saw her as she truly was. Though it was pointless, Zelda frantically ripped her face wraps upward, covering as much of her exposed face as she could. Too late. Too late. You're... Roven started, but couldn't seem to finish the sentence. His mouth hung open. She had to stop this. Without thinking, she grabbed his arm and yanked him into the inn. He allowed her to drag him across the dining area into a dark corner where she usually sat to read or sew while innocuously people-watching. Thankfully, very few people were dining today. Just that Hylian man from this morning who gave them only a quick glance, and an older woman Zelda recognized as a Sheikah elder. She sat Rovin down, his expression unchanged, and took her seat across from him with a huff.
Listen,
She began.
you must never tell a soul what you just saw.
Somehow, his eyes grew even larger. Your voice!
Yes, my voice. My whole existence, really.
Rovin simply frowned, unable to comprehend what was happening. It seemed perhaps he didn't actually know who she was, a princess in hiding, which was good. She could still spin it in a way that would not reveal her true identity. I don't understand. If you're not, then who are you? Her mind raced, panic spreading throughout her limbs.
I'm hiding from the Hyrulean royal family.
She sputtered. It was the first thing she could think of that was closest to the truth, without being the truth. Hyrule. That sounds familiar, Rovin said.
It's far from here.
Zelda replied, nodding.
The royals there are after me and my aunt. You see, we aren't accepted in Hyrule. Not really. Sheikah, I mean.
Rovin's frown deepened. Not accepted? In what way?
You don't know the history of the Sheikah and Hyrule? The war that occurred?
Rovin shook his head.
Well, it was a civil war. A bloody war.
She caught herself.
The king of Hyrule ended it. But before that, the Sheikah were a group whom most Hyruleans feared. It's unclear exactly why, but many Hyruleans still do not accept our existence, even after the war was finished. The royal family is still searching for Sheikah warriors involved in the war to execute, and my aunt is one such woman, so we had to run away.
Zelda, breathless, mentally patted herself on the back for coming up with such a story so quickly. Impa would be furious later, however. She was not looking forward to that conversation. Rovin seemed to process Zelda's story better, his frown fading and becoming more sympathetic. That's awful, he said. Are you safe here in Kageno?
We will be,
She replied in earnest.
as long as no one knows we're here.
She widened her eyes at him pointedly. Rovin nodded slowly, finally understanding. He glanced down at the table, considering, then back at Zelda's apprehensive gaze. So you have to disguise yourself as a boy?
Well, it was just one option out of many.
Her breathing hastened. She prayed he would just accept it and stop asking questions. Don't worry, I won't tell anyone, he said, catching on to her anxiousness. He huffed a bit of a laugh. I knew there was something about you. You look Sheikah, but you carry yourself differently from anyone I know. It makes sense you're from somewhere else. Zelda let out a whispery laugh in response. He was already filling in some of the blanks with his own assumptions, which meant she didn't have to. Her heart pounded in her chest as the adrenaline began to leave her body. What's your real name? He asked in a low voice, glancing about to ensure no one was listening.
Oh,
Impa would murder her if she revealed her true name.
just keep calling me Sheik, please. It makes me feel safer.
All right, Rovin agreed. His eyes squinted with excitement. This is so cool, he whispered. I know a fugitive. Zelda sat up straight in defensiveness.
I'm much more than a fugitive, thank you.
She said. Sorry, he replied sheepishly. It's just... this is the most interesting thing that's happened here since I can remember. She didn't know what to say to that. An awkward silence commenced for a few moments until Rovin perked up again. Hey, You really should come up to the grotto with us. That's why I was coming to talk to you. You can get to know everyone a bit better there. It's fun. The waterfalls are neat, and there's a herd of deer that comes by every afternoon. We feed them and everything. You'd like it." He gave her a genuine smile that disarmed her for a few short seconds before she came back to herself. She wanted to go. She truly did. But she didn't know how to let one guard down while having to keep another one up. It was too complicated, too difficult. Rovin seemed to catch on to her apprehension quickly. "I'll be there," he said quietly. "And I won't let anyone ask you anything too personal. We can just hang out." She felt a sudden surge of déjà vu, a feeling of familiarity. Rovin suddenly seemed a lot like Link, someone around whom she could feel comfort, a sense of camaraderie. All this time today keeping up appearances was now suddenly unnecessary, and she could be at least a bit more true to herself. Perhaps if she stuck with him, she could feel more secure, even when she must hide herself. He could be her anchor.
I'd have to ask my aunt first, but all right.
Zelda allowed a little spark to alight in her eyes when Rovin smiled at her. Maybe everything would be okay. Maybe being Sheik would be okay, as long as she wasn't alone. Next time, on Path of Shadow, Zelda waited until Impa was just within reach before twisting her body so that she spiraled around to Impa's back, and only then raised her sword.
That anger you felt, that rage, you need to use it.
Rovin hadn't told a soul about Zelda's identity, but Impa still kept him at a distance, and she made Zelda swear on her life to never reveal her true name or role in Hyrule's royal family to him. And she hadn't, for a while at least. "I see your reflection. Your eyes, they're always alert, always searching. You never get a chance to just take a breath, Zelda." She began to become lost in his eyes, longing to feel whatever it was he was feeling, when suddenly they changed.
We're under attack. Rovin, go home.
"I'm not going anywhere without you." Rather than attacking Impa, she jumped at Zelda. The princess was not ready. "That's all right. I know who you are, princess." Impa stood in the doorway, covered in blood.